They laughed as the scissors cut through her long golden hair, mocking her silence, blind to the tears welling in her eyes. To them, she was just a quiet farm girl, someone easy to target, someone with no voice. But what they didn't know was that the soil beneath their feet, the very land their families depended on for survival, belonged to her. And when the truth came out, the bullies who thought they had all the power would learn a lesson they would never forget. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the schoolyard, where laughter and whispers often masked the cruelty that lurked beneath teenage games. For weeks, a group of students had chosen their target, a girl who rarely spoke, kept her eyes down, and walked with quiet steps that barely made a sound. She wore hand-me-down dresses that smelled faintly of earth and hay, her boots worn from long days helping on the farm. Her hair, however, was her pride, long, golden strands that shimmered in the light like a field of ripe wheat. It was the one thing that made her stand out, though she never intended it to. And because she stood out, it drew the bullies' attention like moths to a flame. On that fateful day, whispers turned to snickers, and snickers turned to plans. The bullies had decided to make a spectacle of her, a cruel show of power that would remind everyone else what happened to those who didn't fit their idea of belonging. When the last bell rang, she lingered by the edge of the field, clutching her books to her chest, her silence mistaken for weakness. The group surrounded her, smirks spreading across their faces as they taunted her, calling her names she'd heard too many times before: farm rat, barn girl, hayhead. Words she tried to let pass through her like the wind through tall grass. But today was different. Today they carried more than words. One of them pulled out a pair of scissors, flashing them like a weapon, their laughter rising in cruel harmony. Her eyes widened, but she didn't scream. Instead, she froze, her breath caught in her chest, her heart pounding so loudly she wondered if they could hear it. They pushed her against the wall, and before she could escape, the sharp blades closed on her golden strands. With every snip, pieces of her hair fell to the ground like dying leaves in autumn, and with every fall, their laughter grew louder. They shaved uneven patches, mocking her as they did, sneering about how she'd never be pretty again, how she'd look like the dirt she came from. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of crying aloud. She stood still, her fists clenched, letting the humiliation wash over her like rain over a stone. When it was over, they left her standing in the mess of her own hair, broken but not shattered. The cool air stung her exposed scalp, and though she wanted to collapse, she gathered the pieces of her pride silently. What they didn't know was that each cruel snip was not a symbol of their power, but of their ignorance. Because beyond the walls of the school, beyond the jeers and the whispers, lay acres of green fields, golden crops, and rolling hills, all of which bore her family's name. Land that their parents tilled, land that their families depended on for food and for life itself. And though she never bragged, never flaunted, never spoke a word of it, the truth was unshakable: she was the heir to everything they thought they owned. As she walked home that evening, the sky painted with streaks of crimson and violet, her steps were heavy but steady. Each gust of wind reminded her of what she had lost that day, yet also whispered of what she still held, the quiet dignity of knowing who she was. Her grandmother's words echoed in her memory, words spoken often as they walked the fields together. "Child, silence isn't weakness. Soil doesn't shout, but it feeds nations. Remember that." Those words became her anchor, pulling her back from despair. At dinner, her family noticed the change immediately. Her mother gasped, her father's jaw tightened, her younger brother's eyes widened with rage. But she simply shook her head, refusing to let her shame spill over the table. She didn't tell them the details, only that it happened. Her father wanted to storm into the town, to demand justice, but she placed a hand on his, steady and calm. "Not yet," she whispered. "They don't know what they've done. Let them." It wasn't forgiveness she carried, it was patience. She understood something they did not. The land beneath her feet was not just dirt, it was power. And one day, they would come to see it. The next morning at school, whispers spread like wildfire. Some laughed at her uneven hair, others pitied her, but she walked with her head high, even as eyes followed her every step. She didn't flinch when they pointed, didn't shrink when they mocked her. She endured, knowing the truth was a silent storm building inside her, waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. The bullies strutted proudly, thinking they had won, never realizing they had sown the seeds of their own downfall. Weeks passed, and the seasons began to change. The harvest season arrived, and with it, the town's families turned to the fields, desperate to gather the crops that would sustain them through the winter. Tractors roared, workers sweated under the sun, and wagons filled with corn and wheat lined the roads. The bullies, too, joined their parents, laboring in fields they had always believed were theirs by right. Yet behind the papers, behind the deeds, behind the soil-stained hands of every farmer stood her family's name. Contracts bore her father's signature. Payments came through their accounts. And the land, all of it, stretched as far as the eye could see, belonged to the girl they had humiliated. It was during the town's harvest festival, when everyone gathered in the square, that the truth revealed itself in a way that could no longer be ignored. A large banner hung across the stage, thanking the landowners whose generosity allowed the community to thrive. And there, written in bold, proud letters, was her family's name. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, eyes darting between the banner and the quiet girl standing in the corner, her short hair now growing back in soft waves. The bullies froze, their faces paling as realization struck. The girl they had mocked, the girl they had stripped of dignity, was the very one whose family owned the land under their feet. She stood tall that evening, not with arrogance, but with an unshakable calm. She didn't seek revenge, nor did she gloat. She simply existed in her truth, letting the weight of their shame rest upon their shoulders. The same hands that had cut her hair now trembled as they served food at the festival, avoiding her gaze, their laughter silenced by knowledge. And for the first time, they understood that the quiet farm girl they had mocked was far stronger than they could ever be. From that day forward, the schoolyard changed. The whispers stopped, the laughter dulled. The bullies kept their distance, haunted by their own cruelty. And those scars remained, both on her heart and in her memory. She walked each day with the quiet dignity of someone who knew her worth. Because power was not in loud voices or cruel laughter. Power was in the soil, in patience, in silence, and in the strength to endure humiliation without breaking. Her hair grew back, longer and stronger than before, and with it grew the lesson that even the deepest cruelty cannot uproot someone who knows where they stand. She had been the girl with no voice, the girl with no power. But in truth, she had always been the one holding the ground beneath their feet. And though they had tried to strip her of pride, they could never strip her of her roots. She learned that day that silence can be louder than screams, and dignity more powerful than revenge. The bullies who had once laughed at her hair now worked the land her family owned, forever reminded that the girl they thought powerless had always been the one holding their futures in the palm of her hand. And she never had to lift a finger to teach them. The land did it for her. The day of the cruel prank had ended, but its shadow lingered far longer than the laughter that echoed through the empty schoolyard. The bullies had walked away triumphant, leaving her with shorn hair and bruised pride, convinced they had stripped away everything she valued. Yet what they could not see, blinded as they were by arrogance and ignorance, was the truth hidden in plain sight. The quiet farm girl they mocked, the one they believed to be beneath them, was the heir to the land that their families depended upon. Every acre of wheat, every row of corn, every patch of soil that their fathers and mothers worked tirelessly each day, belonged to her family. And the silence she carried was not weakness, it was power, quietly waiting to be revealed. She had always chosen to keep this knowledge to herself. At school, she lived simply, blending into the background, never speaking of the long family line that had owned the surrounding farms for generations. Her father believed in humility, teaching her that wealth in the soil was far more valuable than wealth in words. They did not boast, did not flaunt, and never used their status to belittle others. It was a life of quiet dignity, rooted in the belief that the land spoke louder than pride ever could. Yet the cruel act of the bullies had shifted something inside her. For the first time, she wondered if silence was enough. The following weeks were heavy with unspoken truths. Each morning she walked to school with her cropped hair, head high despite the snickers and whispers. Each evening she returned to the vast fields of her family's land, where the golden horizon reminded her of her true place in the world. There, among the rustling leaves and the hum of cicadas, she found solace. Her family never pressed her to reveal the full story of what happened that day. Her father's stern silence and her mother's gentle concern were answer enough. They trusted her to decide when and how the truth should come to light. It was at the annual town meeting, held in the wide hall at the center of the village, that the shift began. Every family gathered to discuss harvest shares, payments, and contracts with the landowners. She sat quietly beside her father, listening as voices rose in debate over crop yields, machinery costs, and the division of profits. The bullies' fathers and mothers spoke passionately about the hard work their families had put into the land, their voices tinged with frustration at rising expenses. Yet when the final agreements were read aloud by the town clerk, all eyes turned to her father, the man who owned more land than anyone else in the county. He signed the papers with quiet authority, and in that moment, the truth became undeniable. The bullies shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the realization creeping over them like an unwelcome chill. Their families' livelihoods were bound directly to hers. The fields they sweated in, the harvests they celebrated, the very food on their tables, all flowed from the soil her family owned. The power they had mocked in the schoolyard suddenly seemed hollow compared to the authority she had carried in silence all along. And yet she said nothing, offering no smug glance, no cruel word in return. Her silence, once a target for their scorn, had become the very thing that magnified their shame. Over the weeks that followed, the truth spread beyond the walls of the meeting hall. Whispers replaced the old laughter in the school corridors. The same students who once sneered at her now stepped aside to let her pass. Teachers looked at her differently, some with newfound respect, others with pity for the way she had been treated. The bullies themselves grew quieter, their once loud voices diminished, their arrogance subdued by the weight of what they had learned. They no longer called her names, no longer tugged at her clothes or sneered at her silence. Instead, they avoided her gaze, haunted by their own cruelty. But she was not interested in their fear. What mattered to her was the deeper lesson taking shape in her heart. She had endured humiliation without exposing her truth, had suffered cruelty without striking back. And when the truth finally came to light, it had not been because she shouted it to the world, but because the world had no choice but to see it. The land, her inheritance, spoke for her, louder than any words she could have uttered. One autumn evening, after the last of the corn had been harvested and the fields lay bare beneath the fading light, she walked along the rows with her father. The air was crisp, the earth fragrant with the scent of soil turned over for winter. Her father placed a weathered hand on her shoulder, his eyes soft with pride. "You see, child," he said quietly, "power isn't in what you say or how loudly you say it. Power is in what cannot be taken from you. They could cut your hair, they could laugh at your silence, but they could never take the roots of who you are. That's what the land teaches us." Those words sank into her heart like seeds into fertile ground. She realized then that what the bullies had done was not a defeat, but a test. A cruel, painful test that revealed not her weakness, but her strength. The hair they cut would grow back, stronger and thicker than before. But the lesson she had learned, that dignity lies in knowing your worth even when others don't, would stay with her forever. Time passed, and the memory of that cruel day faded from the town's gossip, though it never left the hearts of those involved. The bullies grew quieter, their arrogance tempered by the knowledge of their dependence. They still worked the fields each harvest, bending their backs beneath the sun, their hands blistered by the same soil that carried her family's name. Each time they planted a seed, each time they pulled a wagon through her land, they were reminded of the girl they once mocked. The girl who had no need for revenge, because the truth itself had done the work for her. As her hair grew back, she carried herself with even greater grace. No longer did she shrink into the background. She walked with quiet confidence, her silence no longer a shield but a choice. She knew now that her power did not come from shouting or proving herself. It came from patience, from the unshakable truth that the land beneath her feet gave her a strength no one could strip away. And though the bullies never apologized outright, their silence became its own confession. Each awkward glance, each avoided word, each moment of hesitation was proof that they had learned their lesson. They had tried to break her, but instead, they had exposed their own fragility. She had been the quiet farm girl they thought powerless, yet in reality, she was the one holding the ground beneath their futures. Years later, as she stood at the edge of the fields, now a young woman ready to take on the responsibilities of her family's legacy, she looked out at the horizon with a steady heart. She remembered the cruelty, the scissors, the laughter. But she remembered too the silence she had chosen, the dignity she had held, and the truth that had revealed itself in time. Her hair now flowed long again, golden in the sunlight, a symbol not just of what she had endured but of what she had become. Stronger, wiser, unbroken. And somewhere in the town, the bullies still labored on the fields their families did not own, their lives bound to the land that would forever remind them of the girl they had once underestimated. A girl who never needed revenge to show them the truth. A girl whose power was rooted not in cruelty, but in the quiet strength of knowing exactly who she was. For in the end, the land always spoke louder than laughter. And it always would.